I'm Maureen Cunningham. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and Director of Water at the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, also known as EPIC. And yes, we're switching gears right now to talk about lead and drinking water, specifically lead service line replacement, with an overview of EPIC's programs and our approach to lead service line replacement. Next slide. So instead of telling you what we do at EPIC, I'm going to tell you why we do it, especially as it relates to lead service lines. We as humans have really gotten good at getting things wrong quickly, and nothing says wrong like lead service lines carrying our drinking water that were installed largely a century ago. When it comes to environmental progress, we often see more red lights than green. And we definitely see this with replacing lead service lines, from a failure to embrace innovative tools and technologies to bureaucratic hurdles to sometimes a reliance on ineffective policies that are not working. So our mission at EPIC across all of our programs is therefore to remove these barriers, create efficiencies, and cut any red tape, because it'll mean getting lead pipes out faster. And the reason why we focus on speed is because we don't think people should be drinking lead water carried by lead pipes for a moment longer. We have an incredible staff of engineers, innovators, and policy experts all week working to make this change faster. You can keep clicking, Bree. So we have on this call, not just myself, I already introduced myself, but also Denise Schmidt. She's our director of our Funding Navigator program. Denise comes from decades of experience working on water issues, most recently for the Public Service Commission in the state of Wisconsin. We're really thrilled to have her on the team. And also she has a deep, deep expertise in helping utilities replace lead service lines. Brianna Gonzalez, based in California, is a graduate of Texas A&M. She has a background in GIS and technology, and she's really helped us straddle the tech and the data pieces that relate to lead service line replacement. So I gave you our mission. The water program in particular at EPIC is focused on eliminating disparities across water systems, changing the odds for disadvantaged communities, and again, removing those barriers that can move us from red lights to green lights. So one of the barriers, and you can click through, Bree, is that we know the largest federal funds for water go through what's called the State Revolving Fund program. And we at EPIC looked at the last decade from 2011 to 2020 of the State Revolving Fund program. And what we saw was that not all water systems have been successful in accessing this funding, even though it is the major source of federal funds for water infrastructure. Next slide. To illustrate this another way, only 7% of eligible water systems have been able to access this funding in the period from 2011 to 2020. And even when we translate that into population size, still not a huge population of users, water users, have been able to access this funding. Next slide. Not only that, we know from a recent report that we put out, and Denise's team spearheaded that, that water systems are telling us themselves that they are not able to access funding. And it's a matter of identifying funding sources, preparing the applications, which is often costly and complex, and also just managing grants. So there's several stages that water systems really need help. So probably most of you know that right now we're in a unique moment for lead service line replacement. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as IJA, also known as a bipartisan infrastructure law or bill. We'll just use IJA today to make it simple. Has $15 billion for lead service line replacement, identification, and planning activities. So that's a huge investment, probably not enough because we have a lot of lead service lines in this country, upwards of 9.2 million. But it is a huge chunk of potential investment to replace lead service lines, in addition to other federal funds through the State Revolving Fund program and through other federal and state sources. We also have water systems mandated now through the new federal regulations to complete inventories of lead service lines by October 2024. We also see in this picture, you see EPA Administrator Michael Regan and the Vice President Kamala Harris paying attention to lead pipes. Everyone from President Biden down to municipalities, we've seen this incredible momentum and political will to replace lead pipes. So our approach at EPIC, which is summarized today, is really to focus on replacing lead pipes, but how do we do this? And it's a combination of technical assistance and community engagement, which Denise is going to dig into a little bit more, data and research. So knowing, for example, where the funds for lead service line replacement are going. So tracking that 15 billion in the IJA legislation to see which communities are receiving funding and not. And then ultimately the holy grail, the innovation and policy change that we want to see, so that that 7% of eligible systems who didn't access, or the rest of the systems that weren't able to access the state revolving funds in the past, can now access them. I'll turn it to Denise.
Thank you, Maureen. I am delighted to be a part of this team at EPIC, and along with our partners and the stakeholders, to be meeting this moment and working on how we change the odds for these communities. And as Maureen mentioned, one of the things we've done is we have launched technical assistance, again, informed by this background, analyzing data and policy, existing policies, what needs to be done, and how can we help play a role in this. So the Funding Navigator, really at its heart, is about connecting communities to public funds for water infrastructure. And so why are we doing this? Well, the reality is, next slide, please, that accessing these funds, as Maureen mentioned, the largest funds for water infrastructure, federal funds for water infrastructure that are broadly available, it's nonetheless complex and costly for very many communities, particularly those that are underserved. Everything from assessing the needs and working with community to prioritize which to tackle first. That can be a complex process. Developing capital plans that typically does not occur at zero cost. There are engineering firms that are typically required, environmental reviews, financial experts, legal experts can be involved in helping develop those capital plans. And then identifying, I think, if you'll recall from the graph that Maureen briefly showed, when we interviewed the folks working at the local level, even those that have a history of working with engineering firms or others have found it kind of puzzling to figure out which funding source is right for them, and if they could be braided. And then the simple task of applying for funds. There's, a lot of these particularly overburdened communities have a lot on their plate. Meeting deadlines, following up can be a challenge. And then constructing and managing projects, of course, requires staff time and expertise. Next slide, please. We do not embark on this work alone. We have national partners for whom we are most grateful in helping us co-design our assistance and also provide hands-on assistance to communities. Southwest Environmental Finance Center for decades has been providing technical assistance in water and other media for communities. Greenprint Partners has expertise in green infrastructure and community-centered design. Moonshot Missions has an expertise in kind of looking at quickly assessing a utility's needs and looking at their operating and capital needs and how to balance them. And then the Anthropocene Alliance is the largest group, convening group of frontline communities that are working on climate resilience and adaptation. So these are our national partners. And then, of course, our place-based partners are vitally important. The folks who really are in these places know best who the stakeholders are, what the sensitivities are around, what the history is in these communities. We also, I will add, have managers from our team who are based in each of these places and work very, very closely with these place-based partners. They have helped co-design our approach in these individual states, and they are indeed, while we have a model that we adhere to, we adapt it for the specific needs of these places. Next slide, please. So the goals of our Funding Navigator work are to, I think we've said a couple of times, change the odds and get more of these utilities that would not ordinarily connect with funds, get connected to the funds. We also want to see better projects financed. And what do we mean by better projects? We mean that they are community-centered. Do they consider in the long run, the financial implications? Are they financially sustainable? Are nature-based solutions considered in evaluating alternatives? And of course, making sure that lead service lines get replaced faster and more equitably. Next slide, please. So because our technical assistance is focused on this really vitally important better project, if you will, we base it on our experience providing TA in a number of places across the country. So here's an example of places that have received our assistance in the past, excuse me. And there too, I will highlight that we worked in partnership. So one of the things we have seen is that partnerships and leaderships at the local level really are critical to helping move this forward. It takes vision and tenacity to tackle this issue. So we are very grateful for those leaders there that have made this work, helped this work move forward and informed our TA going forward to make it better. Next slide, please. That work has included starting from, step one is, of course, identifying, locating, and mapping lead service lines. Of course, the challenge here is we're talking buried infrastructure, and depending on where you are in the country, good portions of that infrastructure is on private property. Some examples of our work there is, you'll see that tap card there in the left-hand side. That is from our work in Chelsea, Massachusetts. Currently, Chelsea's taking those tap cards and digitizing them in partnership with 120 Water and moving them from paper records to digitized records. The dashboard, as we know, involving community, again, back to that community-centered piece, it's very important. So the importance of translating this kind of complex technical information for the public is important. So here, Hazel Crest, Illinois is working on this dashboard that will help translate this technical information and make it more transparent and publicly available. Key points to making equitable lead service line replacement happen. Next slide, please. So whether it's lead service line replacement or looking at a new pump house, our technical assistance model integrates community. The first part of it from that flow chart I showed you earlier, the assessing the needs and making sure the priority projects are up the top of the list and are tackled first is an important piece of it. And then also involving community in the design of the projects. Are the alternatives that affect their neighborhood addressed and designed in a way that is acceptable to the community and makes things better, or does not exacerbate existing historical harms, and really integrating community throughout the process and making sure that their voices are heard on projects that matter to them. Next slide, please. So for those interested in connecting with the Funding Navigator, Bree, you can go ahead and click through, please. There are a number of different ways. Number one, EPIC has, we have a button on our website where you can learn more about the Funding Navigator, who's eligible, what kinds of entities it makes sense to work with a Funding Navigator. We have a button there to request assistance. We also, through our place-based partners, have several of our place-based partners. Here's an example from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission. Our partners in Michigan have a similar button, in New Jersey as well, where you can connect with experts and get going on the path towards funding. And then I'll mention that we are very grateful to have been selected as a National Environmental Finance Center by the EPA. So while we have launched the Funding Navigator with our philanthropic funds, our work as an environmental finance center will be starting up soon. And this button is already available to folks who are interested in connecting through the EPA. EPA will help connect local organizations and municipalities with an environmental finance center that makes the most sense for them. And that is it for me. I'll pass it over to Bree.
Thank you, Denise. So last year, in collaboration with the Environmental Defense Fund and the Massive Data Institute at Georgetown, we launched a project that will track the intended use of the Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, which also includes the supplemental funding from IJA. And to do this, we looked at each state's list of fundable projects located within their intended use plans. And through this process, see if my slides will go. We noticed one main thing, and that's the need to standardize these data. Because these data are coming from each state's intended use plans, there is a huge variation in the format of the intended use plans and the terminology that's used from state to state, which makes it difficult to create one unified data set, which can be used for a variety of different applications, including to see who's getting funded, who's not getting funded, which projects are we missing out on, and who we should look to try and aim that funding towards, which communities. And so 3 main challenges we noticed was first actually collecting the data. Because each state has a different format of even just their website, it's sometimes difficult to find where these intended use plans are located, and even when the timeline is to see when they're released. And so that makes it difficult to figure out, even just to start receiving that information. The second piece is actually making sense of the data. And so I have a couple of examples of intended use plans. The first one is Illinois, and you'll see that it does a really great job at laying out who's applying for funding, has a very clear table of that information, but the problem is it's actually a photocopy. And so whenever you hover your mouse over the table, it's just an image, so you can't even copy and paste, which makes it difficult to change it from this PDF version into an Excel or CSV version, which is how we do anything with data. The next example that I have is Pennsylvania, that has these really awesome project descriptions. They're really detailed. They include what exactly the project is going to be doing, which helps us identify if it's lead related or if it's related to emerging contaminants or other infrastructure projects. The problem is it's not in a table format, which makes it harder to match the different information together and put it into that same Excel or CSV version. And then the third example that I have is Indiana, which does a really, really awesome job at laying out all of the information. It's in a PDF that's easily digestible. It's not just an image. So they're definitely one of the best examples of what a project priority list could be. And then the third piece that was really challenging for us is how are we going to share this information to the public to make it easy to understand and digestible? And the best format that we found to do this was actually in the form of a dashboard. And so we're excited to launch this pretty soon. We're aiming for early June. And this dashboard will include all of the information that we just talked about. Where's the funding going? How much is the state planning to use? And then how much of that is benefiting certain types of projects, such as lead, emerging contaminants, and in disadvantaged areas. And we have this big disclaimer on the front whenever you first log in to the dashboard. The first thing is going to talk about, well, what is an intended use plan? Where is this data coming from? and why is it important to you? The second piece, we'll talk about all of our different data caveats and limitations, disclaimers, all of those different pieces. One of the main pieces is because it's coming from the state's intended use plans, this is all the state's definition. So we really can't make any cross-state comparisons. So we've done a couple of things to try and limit folks from doing that. And then the last piece is some tips on how to actually use the dashboard itself. And then once you click out of that screen, there are a couple different features that I'd like to highlight. The first is that there is going to be a sidebar that has each state that you click on, the information included for it. And that will be updated based on certain caveats or things that we've noticed for each state. The second piece will be to change the format from just a state version to an actual table, which I'll show you on the next slide pretty soon, so you can see what that data looks like. The third piece is a summary of the project information. And as I mentioned, we've broken it up into what is from the base state revolving funds, what comes from the supplemental buckets, as we've been referring to them from IJA. So just general supplemental lead projects, emerging contaminants. And then if you wanted to reference that pop-up again, you can just press that little info button. And then because the data is so difficult to find, we wanted to make this easy for everyone who is interested in it. And so we have a download button for each state. And then included within that, there's also a glossary of terms that you can reference. And there is some info on how we actually match the projects, whatever the state's terminology they used, to the harmonized uniform version that we decided to use. And so to toggle, the next piece you can do is toggle in between the state to the actual data version. So if you just want to look at it and don't have to download it, you're able to do that as well. And with that, I'll pass it back to Maureen.
Thanks, Bree. And to wrap this up, and you can keep clicking, Bree, we have all this leads to some great policy changes that we recommend. We are policy analysts, and we have policy on our analysts on our team. And I'm not going to read everyone, but our overarching goal is to replace lead pipes quickly, efficiently, and equitably, preferably over the next decade, which actually started with President Biden naming that 10-year timeline, and just knowing that it's going to take not just the technical assistance, the data collection Bree described, but also policy change at the local, state, and federal level. Next slide. And another important aspect is learning and sort of this adaptive management learning approach, generating lessons learned from on the ground. When we see Newark, New Jersey replacing their lead pipes in 3 years very successfully, what were the ingredients that went into that success? When we see communities struggling to replace their lead service lines, or having high costs associated with that, what can we learn and bring to the discussion to help the next community? And then we have, and hopefully Denise can share some other links in the chat, some key ways we share lessons across different forums. I just got back from DC yesterday. We had an in-person meeting at the Reservoir Center in DC with various lead advocates and government officials to talk about lead financing. The White House held a summit in January. The picture of the vice president was from that summit. And we're a part of now this White House Get Out the Lead partnership, in addition to a whole bunch of municipal officials from around the country. And then on the State Revolving Fund in particular, we know there's a need for advocacy and policy change. And we're working with several groups on a SRF, State Revolving Fund Advocates Forum, to exchange ideas, talk about a lot of it's education, because this is complicated stuff, as you could tell from Bree's presentation, and to educate each other on what's going on with the funding. And then ultimately also paying attention to when states put out their state revolving fund intended use plans, which is a lot of words to just say how they intend to use this money. So we're paying attention to that, connecting to advocates and policymakers around the country. So ultimately, this is an effort, an all hands on deck effort around the country. Again, I just came from a meeting with several policymakers from the Congress, from the White House, different non-governmental organizations. EPA was there. This is really an effort that requires all of us, especially if we're aiming to get lead pipes out over the next decade. We at EPIC are just thrilled to partner, as you can tell by so many partner logos in our reports and on these slides. So we'd love to collaborate if anyone is out there and wants more information. Thank you.